Welcome to Leadership for Equality by UNESCO and the Associated Country Women of the World, a podcast to explore the personal and professional experiences of women around the world and to discuss the opportunities, challenges, obstacles, and successes on their journeys.
We will ask our guests what leadership means to them and ask them to share their stories and ideas that will inspire more women to embrace leadership and be embraced as leaders.
Hi, we are your hosts. I am Garance Sarlat.
And I'm Nick Newland. In this episode, we are discussing the leadership of women for social change. We highlight their experiences and the challenges they've faced and ask them to share good practices and recommendations.
As you know, this podcast is about gender equality and women's leadership, but UNESCO's mandate is much, much broader, and we combat racism and discrimination. We notably have the Global Forum Against Racism and Discrimination, which was launched in 2021 in Paris, and then took place in Mexico and in Sao Paulo last year. And we also have masterclasses against racism and discrimination to raise awareness, sensitize young people, and a diversity of stakeholders across the world and across society. In this episode, we will ask our guests to tell us about themselves, their ambitions, their challenges to advance this social change. Our guests will tell us about themselves and their ambition to advance social change and to advance also those intersectional questions and discussions to make sure that when we talk about gender equality and women's empowerment, we are talking about all women.
I'm delighted to introduce now our first guest, Desirée Cormier Smith, US Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice at the United States Department of State, appointed in June 2022. Ms. Cormier Smith has broad experience in policy and foreign service, with a career that has so far included postings in Mexico, South Africa, and policy briefs covering Africa, Europe, and Eurasia.
As you may know, the United States of America rejoined UNESCO last year, and we are delighted to now welcome our first American guest in this podcast. As the US Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice, you have a unique role to advance social change, and you have joined your forces with UNESCO in past editions of the Global Forum Against Racism and Discrimination. In this position, how do you promote women's leadership, especially for women of marginalized communities, such as women of African descent, Indigenous women, Roma women, and many other women in the margins?
Thank you for that question. So my mandate is a brand new mandate for the State Department. I am the first Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice. It's a position that was just created in 2022. And my mandate is to ensure that U.S. foreign policy and programs and assistance promote and protect the human rights of members of marginalized racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities, including people of African descent, and to build global partnerships to combat structural racism, discrimination, and xenophobia around the world. My mandate was not created because we think we have already solved these challenges in the United States. I think as everyone can tell, we are still very much grappling with these challenges here in the United States. However, we recognize that we're not the only country grappling with these challenges, right? These really are global challenges that will require coordinated and sustained global solutions. Now, I start there because my mandate is specifically focused on combating racial inequities. However, we know that even within these communities, whether they are Indigenous communities, Roma communities, communities of African descent, that women also face unique challenges and multiple forms of discrimination. There's sort of hierarchies, right? So women can face multiple intersecting forms of discrimination, as can people with disabilities or LGBTQI+ persons, or people from religious minority backgrounds who also belong to these communities. So it's critically important that when we engage with these communities and we promote their rights, we promote the rights for everyone in the community, not just certain members of the community, but everyone in the community. And in order to do so, I always take an intersectional approach, but I also try to work very closely with my counterparts who are focused on other marginalized communities. And this is critically important. I join the ranks of other special envoys and ambassadors who are focused specifically on other marginalized communities, including our Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues, Ambassador Geeta Gupta. and our Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, Ambassador Rashad Hussain, our Special Envoy for LGBTQI+ rights, Jessica Stern, our Special Advisor for International Disability Rights, Sarah Mankara. It's important for me to name all of those positions and all of those persons who currently occupy those positions, because we know that unfortunately many people are marginalized because of their identities. And so it's critical that the collective of us work very closely together, because again, people can be many things at once. And I think it's also important to name all of my colleagues, because it explains how I am able to focus exclusively on racial and ethnic inequities and discrimination.
Maybe you could enlighten us a little on the challenges that you share, the ones that are perhaps the most persistent, and the solutions that you've developed together with your colleagues to address them.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I also think it's no coincidence that the majority of those colleagues that I listed and named actually are women. And I see this a lot in the initiatives that we do in my office, including the Global Anti-Racism Champions Award that we just inaugurated last year, that the Secretary of State now gives annually to leaders in civil society around the world who are really fighting back against the structural racism and discrimination and xenophobia facing their communities. Of those 6 that we awarded in 2023, 5 of them were women. I think when you empower a woman, you empower an entire community, you empower an entire society. Similarly, we launched a new initiative called the Indigenous Young Leadership Coalition that brought 6 phenomenal young Indigenous leaders from across the Western Hemisphere to the United States to engage with their Native American counterparts at the White House Tribal Youth Forum. And coincidentally, all 6 of those leaders happened to be women. That was not a criteria, but I think it just goes to show that women often are at the forefront. Women and young people, frankly, are often at the forefront of fights for social justice. In terms of the challenges, I mean, where to begin? This work is not easy. For many of us engaged in this work, it is deeply personal. So it is hard to not personalize the pushback. It is hard to personalize the resistance because, again, it's personal. And so for many of us, when people say it's not important to promote racial equity or to advance the human rights of people of African descent, of Roma people, of Indigenous peoples, it can feel like a personal attack. And they're saying that it's not important that your human rights are respected. So that's really hard. I think the other big challenge is systemic, right? It's structural. These inequities are the results of long historical legacies of dehumanization of certain peoples, of the transatlantic slave trade, of colonization. And so these inequities and the structural barriers are often baked in to institutions and to societies in ways that can often sometimes feel impossible to overcome. And so it is important to remind ourselves that these problems were not created overnight, so they cannot be solved overnight. And that's really hard because these challenges are urgent, right? We're not talking about some theoretical issue or a theoretical problem. We're talking about people's lives. And so there is a real sense of urgency and a need to address these challenges with urgency. But also, I think it's critically important to understand that you have to steel yourself for the long haul if you're going to really be in this fight for true social and racial justice.
Building on what you just said, I think it's important to inform our audience that at UNESCO, we have a project called The Routes of Enslaved Peoples. It has been launched in 1994. It is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year. And this project is about shedding light on the history of slavery, the history of the slave trade, and its impact on contemporary forms of racism and discrimination. Of course, it's still now as relevant as ever. As we look into the past, we must also look into the future. And we know that global challenges are sort of always expanding, especially when we look into the digital world. That's something that I'd like to ask you about. Especially as you know, UNESCO adopted in 2021 the recommendation on the ethics of AI. It's the very first global instrument with a global standard for the field of AI. It has a dedicated chapter on gender, a dedicated chapter on climate change, one on gender inequalities and discrimination, including racism and discrimination based on ethnicity. I was wondering, how does your work address discrimination in the digital world, in AI, in new technologies overall? And could you maybe share some good practices with us?
It's really important that we create a framework and a global consensus on AI and the ethical considerations for AI now, and not be reactive 10, 20 years down the line after so much harm is already caused. I think what concerns me the most about AI is the potential for AI to exacerbate and heighten existing inequities. That will be detrimental because we know that AI is only as good as the input it's based on, right? And so if that input is already biased, that has the potential to really have life or death consequences. And we've seen it already play out in many ways in terms of health biases that AI use, in terms of AI systems that some criminal justice programs across the world use that could potentially promote false sort of recognition because they don't recognize facial features from certain racial or ethnic groups. That is extremely dangerous. So that's why the work that UNESCO is promoting to promote ethics of AI is so critical. And we fully support that. But again, it's really important that we take a human rights perspective and that we try and get some global consensus.
So, looking to perhaps a more positive or optimistic question for the future, so often conversations at UNESCO resolve to the same topic, which is youth. Whether it's youth as future leaders, as our future generations, the challenges or the opportunities that they provide in our understanding of what's coming next. You currently serve on the Advisory Council of Global Kids, an educational non-profit that works to inspire underserved youth to pursue careers in public policy and public and global affairs. Obviously, it relates directly to what we're talking about, which is women's leadership. So could you share how your work with this council helps that goal and empowers young women and girls to achieve their ambitions?
Yeah, I really love Global Kids. And for me, I became involved with this organization just because it reminded me of all the organizations and programs and extracurricular activities that really opened my eyes when I was in high school and middle school to opportunities outside of my neighborhood, outside of my community. And so I know personally and firsthand the power of these kinds of programs that really aim to help young people, particularly those who come from underserved communities, particularly Black and Brown young people in the United States, who may not see the challenges that they are facing in their local community as part or connected to global challenges. To hear the things that they are going through and to hear the challenges that they have to face on a daily basis in the United States and every country in the world, right? Where there continue to be generations of people who are prevented from accessing opportunities, prevented from living up to their full potential simply because of the race or ethnicity they happen to be born. So I really am grateful for the work of Global Kids because I truly believe in the power of solidarity and the fact that these are global challenges that will require global solutions.
Thank you, Desirée, for being such a role model to us, to them, to the world, and for telling us a little bit more today about your work for racial equity in the US. Now, let's turn to our next guest, Bushra Ahmed.
Bushra is a seasoned and distinguished civil society leader from the UK, recognised for effecting transformative change both at the grassroots community level and in the boardroom, leveraging her expertise as a strategic consultant and an entrepreneur. Bushra, hello.
Hello, Nick. Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here.
You've said in the past in our conversations that the 2011 riots in London were a catalyst for your drive to ensure social justice, and specifically start targeting youth and women's empowerment so that you were making sure that these are not only well understood but represented in the boardroom. Can you tell us a little more about your experiences and what started that journey?
So when the riots happened, and I had to go into these rooms to try and get the compensation for the victims, there was an absence of women's voices from the affected communities in those rooms. And that meant I had to step up and be that voice, or we wouldn't have got the justice. So I used local and national media to keep the victims in the headlines. And following on from that successful campaign, I actually realised that I needed to be at the tables where decisions are being made that actually affect women and girls, particularly from diverse communities, because often they were being made without any real understanding of the issues around diversity and culture at grassroots level. So I had to channel the resilience and grit that I'd seen in my parents and also use my faith to get through those tough times. But that journey showed me that I had something important to offer wider society. So I was quite strategic in the path that I took then to approach boards where I felt that lack of diversity, but also where they recognised the need and the benefit of having a voice and experience like mine at the table. And then through those roles, I've been able to champion gender equality and also something that I feel is important, which is belonging.
As you've said, you're very active in your local community, and this is spreading to an international stage. You were recently a first-time delegate of the UN Commission on the Status of Women. Could you maybe tell us a bit more about how you're using your space and ensuring representation now beyond your immediate community at the global level?
It was such a privilege to be invited to go to the UN, and I was so fortunate to get to meet so many incredible people and organisations from all across the world. And I've always maintained that communities have the solutions to most of the problems that they face, and that we as a society should be looking at what's strong and not what's wrong. So at this commission, I think that was so visible in the General Assembly events and the side events where women were talking about what they were doing in their communities to make real and lasting progress. Gender equality, empowering young women, young people as well, and climate change. I think it was such a powerful coming together with some fantastic networking opportunities that I've already followed up on. In fact, meeting you there, Nick, led me to this amazing opportunity to be here today. At UNESCO. And I've always advocated that as women, we need to be able to communicate and collaborate globally, learn from each other in these kind of spaces. I did wish that there was more diversity and equity in who was able to attend, because the cost of attending meant that it excluded many voices that really should have been there to contribute their valuable experience and expertise. So I'd like there to be more opportunities for this kind of global connection, because I think there's a real power in that. And I found it really exciting and a really good experience, but as I said, it needs to be built on.
We certainly see in civil society spaces all the time that there is a real problem, a funding deficit and a support deficit that challenges representation actually being representative. You work in various sectors across business and community activism. So how do you mix and match your priorities in those different sectors and really foster long-term change for gender equality and benefiting your local community?
I think that when I was talking about what's strong and what's wrong, it's because communities have the solution to their own problems. But sometimes in the civil sector, I think, these organizations that are set up to help people sometimes become self-sustaining. So in this cutthroat world of funding, sometimes you chase the funding rather than the need of the people that are actually looking or needing that help. And in a way, it can be, sometimes the communities have their own solutions that are better at nurturing those people back to health. So, for example, around mental health or educating their own people, or even with finance, sometimes our communities used to find their own solutions. But I think in the work that I do, we need more people and their voices like mine with lived experience at the highest level of decision making, whether that's through organisations like 50/50, for example, where I'm a trustee and we advocate for gender equality in the UK Parliament, or through the other organisations that I'm part of. So it's the only way to get the progress needed to reach the SDG goals set by the UN. So if anything, CSW 68 reinforced that poverty mainly affects women and girls. Well, I think we already knew that, but the worst off are those from diverse communities. So we really need to have those voices at the table, ensuring that decisions that are taken do benefit the most vulnerable. And I do believe we need more collaboration and collective action between women's groups, both nationally but globally as well, on social justice issues, because I think there's so much that we can learn from each other. You know, from think tanks to politicians, charities or foundations, we really need to build that global movement and be that strong voice and advocate for sensible long-term policies to reduce poverty, better early years childcare and education, better social care provision for the elderly. These are the foundations of good society and set the good baseline for future generations to follow.
So we know that your work has been recognized because you were shortlisted for the National Diversity Award in 2023 in the UK. Can you tell us a bit more about your work as the role model that you are, as a peer mentor, and the kind of experiences that you lead to drive change?
So being shortlisted for that National Diversity Award in 2023 as a positive role model for gender, it was so humbling, deeply gratifying, recognition of my commitment and work promoting gender equality, but also just, validation for myself that I was doing something right. And I think you always have that feeling of, am I making a difference? It really gave me the confidence to go on. For me, I'm determined to build on the momentum that I have as a leader and advocate for gender equality. I'm making the most of every opportunity that I have to keep inspiring and empowering women of all ages through my own example. I think I've shown, however old you are, whatever your qualifications are or not, in my case, or my background, it's never too late to start to make that difference. Podcasts, motivational speaking engagements, and to take on those board and advisory roles where I can share my journey and experience. And I think it's also a skill to always be open to learning. So not having a closed mindset, I think. And that's why I think I have a unique and diverse perspective. Whether it's in corporate situations, there's always that young woman there who's in the room, who sees somebody like me sitting at the table and says, wow, because they don't generally see somebody like me at those tables and at that level. So I think that's really inspiring. I mean, recently I took part in a co-creation week in Sweden, where I was with 10 young people from a creative fashion background design, tasked to come up with solutions to toxic cultures in corporates and organizations. And we came together. I had a lot to contribute. I learned a lot from them. And we came up with something that was really powerful and productive. So I'm just going to continue amplifying the voices of women from diverse backgrounds. And I'm always actively seeking sponsors and allies, women and men in corporates and organizations, to open those doors and those opportunities so that I can pay that forward to the communities that are looking at me as that role model by seeing where I'm going, and then just leveraging the influence that I have as a leader. I think that we could achieve lasting and meaningful change if we were to work together. Then I think we could probably see that in my lifetime.
Bushra, can you tell us more about your personal background? What has put you in the position where you've really been able to not just see but help achieve change in your community?
Well, I grew up as a child of immigrants in the 1970s in the UK with a lot of anti-Muslim feeling, and we had skinheads and there was a lot of racism. My dad was a political campaigner, so we learned from him. We had the Times newspaper every day. So we were a very political family and very empowered as young women by my parents to kind of stand up for ourselves. And so I was already working before the riots with women in my own community. I was empowering them and taking them up to Parliament, for example, to say, look, you're women, you're migrants coming into the country, you have rights, but you also have responsibilities to be part of the country, to integrate. So I would take them up to Parliament in groups of 70. I think I took about 5 groups up and just showed them where the seat of democracy was and why it was important that they took part in their local council elections and stuff like that. And then I was a fundraiser and raising money for a disaster relief charity for years. And I was working very much within my faith community and doing that kind of work. I ran a business for 30 years. But then the riots obviously came at a time and completely changed how I was working, because then I was forced to go outside of that quite safe bubble that I was in within my faith community and actually move outside. And one of the other things that I was doing in all of that time was doing tours at my mosque, which was to have that cultural awareness with schools and visitor groups coming in. We had 3,000 or 4,000 children coming in every year. I'm still doing them. People just come in and they're able to ask questions. They're able to ask, especially after 9/11 and everything that went on, there was a lot of curiosity about who these people are. They're in the middle of our community. And, they would ask me things. I think there's a fear behind a lot of it, a fear and ignorance. So the most asked question I got was, why do Muslim women wear black? And I would say, because it's slimming. If I was, if I was thinner, I'd wear pink. But, and so that always got that reaction, and that's immediately breaking down that barrier. And then they understand that actually they're not so different and we're not so different.
Thank you very much, Bushra. It was a pleasure to have you here with us today. Now, let's turn to Agnes Siteya. She is the founder and director of the Beads for Beads Trust and a community leader from the Masai Mara in Kenya.
Agnes, working within your community in the Mara, how do you promote women into leadership roles? Can you share some specific ideas and strategies that you've used to empower women to take leadership roles and how that contributes to decision-making processes in the community? How does that work for you?
Thank you, Nick. Being an educator, I've been working with women in the Mara for about 20 years, I think so. And also do the school work. Part of the work that I do is empowering women. And one of the things that I always value and insist to be done is education, because I believe education is the most and only tool that we can use to change the world and also eradicate poverty. But it's unfortunate that in the Mara, women above 45 and above, most of them have not got education. So we always try our best to do some workshops and trainings to bring them on board, to know what's happening in the world, especially to let their voices be heard. So we do empower them economically. For example, for the beadwork that you visited when you came to the Mara, that's one of the things that we empower these women, because when a woman is empowered, the whole community is empowered. Because in our Maasai community, only 2 things that belongs to the woman is the bead and the milk from the cow. The cows belong to men. So the only thing they have is the beads and at their disposal, and the milk they milk from the cows. Having the beadworks and making them not just for cultural occasions, but to make money out of it so that they can take their children to school, they can change their lives. And that's one of the ways that we are trying to empower these women. Another way is in every community meeting, or we call them barazas, we make sure that women are also there so that they can raise their voice, they can be heard, they can say what they see it's supposed to be done in the community. We try to make them, the leaders, opinion leaders in the community have protocols in their meetings that if there are only 4 people to speak, at least 2 men and 2 women are given chances to speak so that these women can also be heard. Another way that making sure that when there are non-governmental organizations and government programs, we make sure that even women attend those programs so that they can get to know what to do, especially in their communities, because they're agents of change.
Now we must jump into tricky questions. And this relates to men. As you know, at UNESCO, we have a program called Transforming Mentalities about engaging men for gender equality. And I want to ask you, Agnes, that because you're ensuring that women are being heard in spaces, in the local meetings and in activities, what has been the reaction from men in the community? Has it been positive? Have they seen the value of women's contribution, of your work? Has it been challenging, and how? How have you dealt with it? I'd love to have more about your experiences in those spaces.
It has not been easy. Village elders, they see women as children, They have to go, they don't have to make decisions, especially in the community. But they have seen even in other counties in Kenya that most of the women have been elected as governors. Some nowadays they have created a space in the political arena that there is what we call the women representative. There's always one woman in the county that is going to represent other women in the national level. So they have seen some have brought changes in their communities. So they are starting admiring and seeing, okay, if women can still make it. For example, if they saw for me being educated and back to the community, I started a girls' school in the Mara called Sekenani Girls. I've also started that empowerment program for the women in the museum. I always go to the villages to make sure that no child is left behind. They have to go to school and get education. So they have seen the importance of women. So at least this the generation of 40 and below, they are seeing the importance of women being in leadership. It's not as the older men before.
As you've said, there's been massive flooding across the Mara recently, and devastating across the Mara and indeed across the whole of Kenya. Can you give us an idea of the impact that that's had on women in the Maasai community, particularly given the other social and economic realities that we've already discussed?
When most of the women could not access to public services, especially like hospitals, when they're almost giving birth, they can't access because there are no accessible roads. The bridges has been carried away, no rivers are flooded. So that's one of the major challenges that the women in the Mara faced, because there are no nearby dispensaries or hospital that can do maternity. So we are lucky we had one at Talek, but the river was not passable. So that's one of the main challenge. A lot of lands was being affected. We are now trying to do a lot of tree planting to see whether we can curb this climate change, because I can see it's a big impact. And Nick, that women don't own anything, so they don't access land. Land is only given to boy child. So if you're a girl in your family, even if your father has 1,000 acres of land, you as a woman, you don't have access to that land. So unless you are lucky to get education so that you can buy a little piece of land and you are married to a man that has a big land. But if you're not married, you're not educated, it's really hard it's just like poverty, because no capital, no money, no education, and most of them are in that category. So it's a big challenge. We are trying to see how women also can be given to own land in Kenya. I think there are some non-governmental organizations that are working, especially in Samburu, to see whether women are also given this piece of land as something that they can start their livelihoods. Nutrition is also one of the challenge that women face during the floods, because most of the food is being bought in the markets, which were not accessible during that time. So women suffered a lot because they didn't have good meals. Yeah, they were just depending on milk, and most of the wild animals came all over, even near to the villages. So they also faced a lot of danger during the floods.
The issue of land rights is a huge one in rural communities in lots of countries, and as you say, it's something you've been trying to address locally. For me, one of the biggest additional obstacles is the isolation of the Mara. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to preserve the wildlife that you mentioned, and obviously at the start of the interview we heard a beautiful little bird tweeting in the background. But that isolation does also make everything a lot more challenging when things go wrong. And so talking about access to medical facilities, educational facilities, This is a real issue, and it's one of the priorities that ACWW has been working on for many years, trying to make sure that women and their communities are able to live in rural areas and still have all the necessary facilities of modern life, that it can still be a choice to live in a rural community and be sustainable.
It's very important that we highlight this context in the podcast. And going back to you, Agnes, now I want to talk about the importance of role models. You've mentioned it, and I would like for us to give us a final comment on why they are so important to young women, what they can do to make sure that they are inspiring and empowering the generation behind them.
Role models are very important in every community, because when we go back and give back to our community, other women that didn't get a chance to go to school will be inspired, and they'll be able to give back to their communities also, because I believe every educated woman, mostly their children also have gone to school. So it will motivate others to do that, and they'll show them the way to follow, especially in their lives. Yeah, and I urge all young girls in Africa, let's go back to the villages, let's be role models and bring change to these communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Agnes. Your experience and your perspective are really fascinating, and it's been an honour to have you with us today.
Thank you for listening to this fourth episode of Leadership for Equality by UNESCO and ACWW. This podcast was recorded at UNESCO headquarters. It was produced and directed by Emmanuel Rudowski. It was developed by Garance, Sarlat and Newland with Juliette, Solesse. Thank you, and see you soon!